All right, well, welcome back to this little slice of paradise out here. Again, couldn't ask for a more beautiful day, and this is the time of year that plein air is really at its best. So if for some reason you run into a little bit of weather that isn't to your liking, one of my favorite artists, his name is LeConte Stewart. He's passed away, but he was a professor of art at University of Utah, where my wife attended, for a number of years. But anyway, he was a die-hard plein air painter, and he even made this little steering wheel mount that was a little easel that he ended up mounting his easel to even paint in the winter time. So you can paint from a window, you can paint from your vehicle, or best case scenario, you find some shelter, you get somewhere outside, and the weather should be pretty cooperative with us between now and the end of the quarter to achieve this. But anyway, again, no screens or photographs allowed on this assignment. We need to be working from direct observation. And we're going to be using this Edgar Payne Rules of Composition templates that is covered in your previous screencast lecture. So I just happen to have a little Xerox copy that I pulled from his book, but you'll need to take really good notes in your sketchbook. And again, you're going to have way more than the 6 required compositions to work from. But what you'll need to do is get out in nature, and you can take things out. Again, that nature that's in front of you is just a catalyst. So here you can see we have the O, or circular composition, which seemed like a really natural fit for where Charles and I set up our box easels today. So just in the interest of time, I did a really quick little thumbnail sketch down here, just mapping in the basic shapes. And I worked in Sharpie just so you could again see the bigger shapes, but you'll probably just want to work in something like graphite or your mechanical pencil. But that being said, if you want to experiment with a brush pen or something like that, you certainly can. My recommendation is to do your drawing in graphite initially, work your colors over the top. Remember, your lines are trapped under those layers of watercolor after you apply it, so you need to kind of render your drawing in whatever capacity you like. Now, there's a lot of artists like John Singer Sargent, who we saw on our week's discussion board about 2 weeks ago. Also was one of those artists that really had a preference for leaving a lot of the graphite down on the paper. So in this case, I just sketched out really lightly with the pencil. This one happens to be one of my favorites. It's a 2mm basically drafting pencil. They're pretty inexpensive, and they come with lead refills that are like this. You can find them on Amazon. I happened to buy this one in Korea at a dollar store, so it was a killer good deal. But they're about $7 or $8 on Amazon, something like that. Sometimes you can find them in 2-packs for about $10. But this is the 2mm, and it gives you a little bit broader, thicker line. And I actually draw all the way up to about 5mm. But a plain old mechanical pencil can do you well at this point, as you've learned in various other assignments. But for this discussion here, just mapped it out in Sharpie so you can see the bigger shapes. And let me come back to the template here. So what we have is an O, right? And so if we look back over at the lake, it's pretty apparent, if I pan out a little bit, how we can find that shape of an O, right? And then it corresponds really nice to what's going on here with Edgar Payne's landscapes, little thumbnails as well. So you can feel free to simplify as you go. You don't necessarily need to draw each and every shape necessarily. You can take something out. Let's say there's a telephone pole that's in your way, or there's a tree that isn't there. Feel free to take it. You're not necessarily graded on how accurately you follow the landscape itself, but rather how you interpret those compositional tools. One other little trick I wanted to show you that works pretty well when you're doing plein air is you're more than welcome to bring a couple clips. These are just really generic run-of-the-mill clips that you can get, like, say, Office Max, or any kind of office supply store. And they work really well because what you can do is you can actually take that clip and clip a portable palette, if you have one, to your watercolor surface like this, and it can be a really portable, easy way to work. And here I like to leave it that way so you can just kind of see me mix the colors as I go too. But bringing a couple just little simple clips, they come in handy for all sorts of things, whether it's storing a brush or storing your palette, etc. Okay, so now what you want to do is you want to lay down some really general washes, and this is a stage where you can be really bold and don't be afraid about working wet into wet. You do want to have a conscious idea of what's going to be darker and what's going to be lighter. My goal is to make the objects in the background much cooler and darker, and then I'm going to have the lighter washes protrude forward towards the viewer. So really what we want is variation. But at this stage, I'm not super worried about necessarily whether this is going to be my actual color. You can mask areas off if you want to, but in all honesty, for these little thumbnails, it's not entirely important. You just might want to sort of map out and leave a couple whites of the paper. But at this stage, this is where you can get really aggressive and start to work wet into wet. Now you'll notice I'm taking the blue and I'm pulling it right down over my trees. That's no big deal because the trees are going to eventually be a lot darker value than that sky, right? So you can mass over all these forms as long as you work light to dark. And in fact, you'll have a little bit more variation in your painting. And speaking of variation, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to come in, I'm going to add some variation in terms of the hues that we're seeing. And I'm exaggerating. I'm not seeing this much yellow in the sky. I'm not even seeing any clouds actually right now of any stature because it's pretty much a clear day and the clouds are really soft. So I've put in a little bit more graphic quality clouds here just for effect. But by placing those clouds behind the trees, it helps additionally divide up some more space, because anytime you can include an example of overlap, it's going to automatically give you a little bit more depth. So you can see I laid down this yellow here. I didn't overwork it, because if I overwork this area, I'm going to have a tendency to gray out my hues and my tones. And that's one of the things that a lot of beginners really struggle with, is getting this kind of clear effect. Now you think of the Ron Stoke examples that we've looked at in the past. He'll lay down washes like this, kind of step away. And one nice thing about working in the outdoors is you don't necessarily have to rely on a hair dryer as much for areas to dry. I mean, you're going to find that your areas of paint are going to dry pretty rapidly, right? So now that this is starting to dry, what I'm going to do is, and you might want to take a few more minutes, but for the sake of the demo, I'm going to start moving into my second layer. I'm going to start glazing in these darker areas. So I'm going to look at these trees. Same sort of thing. Even though my brain tells me, hey, these trees are green, I can definitely have the mass value of most of these forms be green, but it would also be pretty beneficial to think through my temperature differences. So I'm going to want to really cool these temperatures off and push them back into the background. So if I squint my eyes and I look at these trees, they're predominantly cool, right? So I'm going to play a little game of maybe warming this tree up, warming the little landmass that I have in the front of my O or circular composition here, keeping things a little bit warm and playing a game of warm versus cool. But anyway, you can see I'm just quickly massing this in. So just to do just to lay down a little bit of tone in terms of what I was talking about earlier. Still a green hue, but I'm going to mix a little more red into it here. And I'm going to have a little bit more separation just in terms of the temperature. Things right now are pretty subtle, and that's how I want to start. I'm just basically laying down a lot of flat washes, and as things dry, then I can start to glaze. But again, don't be afraid to do some wet into wet work at this time. So I'm just going to start pounding in some violet, some different colors in here, maybe some darker blue. I'm not super worried about the refined quality of it yet, because this is just a base layer for me to kind of work into. But this is a stage where you can get a lot of cool, varied effects of just going wet into wet. And a lot of my favorite painters really rely a lot on the wet into wet techniques. So this would be a good stage for me to start to think about the reflections. It's subtle, but if I look out there and I start to squint my eyes, I know that I have some reflections that start to break down into the bottom of this composition. And one thing you need to remember, and you probably have started figuring this out, you can lay down values a little bit darker than you think they might actually be, because they're going to dry a little bit lighter. And that's our goal, is to kind of work light to dark. So anyway, that is about the place for me to stop. And I'm just going to let these wet to wet areas kind of take over. I'll zoom in so you get a little bit better visual there. But can you see I have an area here where the watercolor is breaking apart from the initial wash, and it's just fusing with these other areas, and it's wet and it's drippy. One thing I will say is I may want to take just a little bit of my slant off. Not a lot, but maybe just a little bit more like that. And I like to work when I'm working watercolors at much more of a pitch than, say, oil or acrylic. Oil or acrylic, I kind of like it straight up and down. But when I'm working here in terms of watercolor, I might have a little bit more of a slope, you know. So anyway, that's about as far as I can take this painting right now until those layers start to dry, and then I'll consider glazing them. So give me a moment, and we'll continue this a little bit later, and we can start to glaze in some other areas. I have a little mallard duck that I put into the bottom of the composition. He's pretty tiny, but he kept hanging out here in front of Charles and I. So I figured he wanted a little bit of play in terms of the pictorial debut of the duck in our foreground. So I'll tell you what, I'm going to pan over here to Charles if he doesn't mind. And Charles, why don't you tell us about your maul stick you found here in nature? This is pretty cool.
Yeah. So to reduce my tremors, I need a maul stick to kind of lean against. So while you were talking about little clips, I just got a little stick, hang it up there, and then now I can press against, and then it takes away the tremors. Also, I'm a oil painter, and so I'm approaching this probably a little bit differently than how David would. So I'm more focused on the details. Plus, I enjoy working those details anyways. But yeah.
No, it looks excellent, Charles. That's great. And you can use a maul stick to really get in there and do those details. The nice thing is you can see how he has that pitched up over the surface of his work. He's able to render without necessarily smearing or contaminating his layers of glazes or scumbles or whatever might be placed under his stick. So that's the nice thing. You won't contaminate your washes. Those of you that are very detail based in your work, you might really want to incorporate a dowel stick. You can see you could use a dowel, or you can be like Charles, where you just end up using a stick from nature. That's awesome.
Yeah, I forgot mine. So,
so improvisation, yeah, that's a good way to go. But anyway, you can see Charles's work's already taking shape. He's starting to go in and block in some of those darks. He's doing a fabulous job. And most of all, I would say the most important thing is just coming out and having fun. Wouldn't you say, Charles?
Absolutely.
I mean, it's beautiful. Enjoy nature. We've all been cooped up quite a bit over the last couple of weeks, and I can't tell you, this feels just amazing to be outside. I don't even really necessarily care how the work turns out, because I'm just enjoying myself so much. It's just so fun to be out here hanging. And so there's something to be said about not taking the work too serious, wouldn't you say, Charles?
Yes, absolutely. You know, and I tend to take my work a little bit seriously, so this is nice to be able to just relax and have fun.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Agreed. All right. Well, maybe we'll look at a future date, and we can all get out here and paint, because it's just feeling great. So, all right. Well, I'm going to sign off here. We'll come back as I work another composition, and maybe we can do a little bit of glazing, and start to push towards those darks. But again, light to dark is always a good system, but there's more than one way to create a painting. So it's totally up to you. And whatever works for you. So, all right, well, there we go. We're going to sign off. I'm going to work on another composition, just reinforce the idea of how Edgar Payne's system is super handy, because maybe one of the most overwhelming things can be coming out and seeing so much of nature and not necessarily knowing like where to start. Like, for example, if you just walked out right here and saw this view, you might be asking yourself, well, where do I even start? But this view right here is probably what I'll choose to do next. But it's the perfect example of a silhouette. So you can see how the tree here, and the camera exaggerates it to our benefit, but how this tree is just a strong silhouette. And we could also call this a cross, or if you really wanted to, you could make this an L. The nice thing is to have a system in your head to kind of take a little bit of the mystery out of working these plein airs. Okay, so we'll see you here in a moment, and hope you're going to get out and have a great time, because I guarantee it's going to be a lot of fun. All right, thanks, friends.